To the Favourites podcast, and we're continuing our What Matters series where we're looking at the book of 1 Chronicles. Today we're in 1 Chronicles chapter 21. Just the usual reminder that this is a good opportunity to pause the podcast or video and to take time to read the Bible passage for yourself. I encourage people, I say this each week, to read it in more than one Bible translation just to get a real flavour of the text, how the narrative is flowing, the language that is used, and understanding. 1 Chronicles chapter 21. And this week we find ourselves in a really tricky, very sticky, very shocking situation. David is ruling over Israel, and he has acted to bring the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. He wants to inquire of God. He wants to seek God. He has been blessed by God in defeating Israel's enemies. He's acting as Israel's provider and protector. Something will happen this week that will put a block in the way, something that will affect David's access into God's presence, David's relationship with God. It'd be good for us to think about, practically about those things that can put a blockage, can affect our relationship to God. What is it that stops you from enjoying a close relationship with God in his presence, enjoying his provision? What is it that stops you from hearing his guidance and accepting and receiving his protection? You see, David is tempted, he is tested. And it happens with a census. Have a look at verse 1 to 5. We're told that an opponent, or Satan, rose up against Israel and incited David to count the people of Israel. Described here as Satan or an opponent. Literally, the word is simply adversary, opponent. When you find that elsewhere in the Old Testament, you find that it comes with the definite article, the accuser, the opponent, the adversary. Satan. So that word is often associated then with Satan, the character that we will get to know through Scripture as the one who accuses God's people and tempts God's people, the one who leads the rebellion of fallen angels against God, the one who will try to tempt Jesus and test him in the wilderness. The one whose ultimate fate is to be thrown into the lake of fire in Revelation. And the one who we've come to see and understand to be behind the temptation in Genesis, the one who takes possession of the serpent to tempt Adam and Eve to fall. But the name Satan, the adversary, as a personified figure, is actually quite rare in the Old Testament. In fact, it only appears in two other places. In Job 1 to 2, Job, where this character of the Satan, the accuser, shows up in the court of heaven, in the heavenly court, and he says to God, hey, I've been going around the earth and I've seen this guy called Job. And God says, what do you make of him? Because Job is righteous. And Satan says, I can sort him out. He may seem righteous at the moment. He may seem to be good and godly. But if I put him to the test, we'll quickly find out that he's not. If I take away all that he owns, all the blessings that you've given him, then he will curse you. Job is of Job experiencing suffering, persecution, testing, the loss of blessing, facing evil, continuing to trust in God, even when his friends around him are saying, you should give up on God. Or maybe you've done something wrong. The other place is in Zechariah 3, verse 1. So it's used rarely. So here is one of three occasions in the Old Testament. Now, fascinatingly, this account will be based on 2 Samuel 24, the original telling of the story closer to the events. And in 2 Samuel 24, the author makes God the source of the provocation for a census. So God, David, God provokes David to do this because God is angry at Israel, and there is judgment coming. Is about this that Satan or adversary without the article, rather than God, is the instigator of David's census. Such a figure does not appear elsewhere in Chronicles or Ezra and Nehemiah. As I've said, it only appears the three times, and Bron says, indeed, only in Job 1 to 2 and Zechariah 3, verse 1, does a somewhat similar figure appear. In both of these cases, however, the definite article is attached, so that the text of Chronicles probably reflects the final stage in the Old Testament's development of a figure of Yahweh's heavenly counselor who not only brings charges against his people, but actually incites them to evil. Since such a figure does not appear elsewhere in Chronicles, it probably reflects the commonly held piety of the day, which hesitated to speak of God as the direct cause of evil. So Braun looks and he says this isn't a word that's used often in the Old Testament. In fact, this is the only time it's used in Chronicles. So he sees the author of Chronicles taking 2 Samuel 24, struggling with the idea of God testing, God tempting, and so putting a figure in between this shadowy figure from the heavenly court, who is an accuser and adversary, a kind of figure set up to test and challenge and check out. So I want to say a couple of things here about this. First of all, I think it is right to say that we see development through scripture of information about Satan. He's not mentioned so often in the early stages, but he's presently there. When some people suggest that there was no idea of such a figure, the Babylonian exile, and that what has happened is that the writers of scripture, the Jews, have developed their theology based on their time in Persia and their encounter with Persian dualism. I don't agree with that. I think the figure predates the idea of somebody who accuses God's people, somebody who tempts an evil one. Is present there earlier, presented right back in Genesis. Doesn't seem to be a major focal point of Israel's history. If it's simply that we are seeing the creation of a character and a bit of skittishness about relating God to direct acts, that would be problematic. Problematic, actually, for a lot of the theories that we have, a lot of the modern theories about how the Old Testament was constructed. You see, Know that Chronicles was written after the exile, put together in its final form, because it takes us right through to after the exile. But there's been a tendency to place other books of the Bible later, particularly Isaiah and Daniel, mainly from people who struggle with the idea of prophecy, of being able to predict the future. People that struggle with God being active in that kind of way in the world. And what you will notice is that those books don't do the same thing. So if they're being dated to the same time, and note that other books in the Bible would be as well, Haggai, Malachi, if they date from that time, and if the Satan is a later imposition, a theological development post-exile, then you would expect them to rely more heavily on this concept. And they don't. So I want to suggest that the theory that the Satan is a character developed later, by the way, I think Daniel and Isaiah were written before the exile anyway. But the point is this, that whole theory, that whole construction of how the Old Testament comes together and how Old Testament theology has been developed, it just doesn't work. It doesn't make sense of the data that we have. So what is going on here? Light Art supplies another option. He thinks that we should see God as the source of this testing right from the end, but also sees the place for an intermediary, that God's actions and always direct, that he uses other intermediaries. That God might be the first and final cause, not the direct and immediate cause. So he thinks that it should simply be translated as an adversary because of the lack of the definite article here. And if so, it would refer to God causing an enemy army to attack. That's possible. That the adversary that provokes David to count, to number, to census the people is not Satan, but is simply one of the powerful enemies of the rival nations around Israel. That's possible, but it seems to be a minority position. I think the majority position is that the chronicler does intend to refer us to the adversary, to the Satan, acting to test God's people. Well, I think Job helps us with that. I think we can see that God is ultimately sovereign, that God has his purposes. And just as people will intend things for evil that God intends for good, so Satan can intend things for evil, but God intends things for good. So Satan will tempt you and me because he wants us to fall into sin. God will test us because he wants to prove us, to refine us, to make us more godly. And the same action, the same event, the same testing can have those two players involved, that Satan is doing it, but God is allowing it, even as Satan has his own purposes, that God uses Satan. Where Satan intends evil, God intends good from it. What was true of Job, what is true of Israel and David here is true of what we face in our lives when we're tempted, when we are tested. Well, David calls in Joab, the commander of his army, and he instructs him to go and take a census, to count, to assess the strength of his armies, verse 2 to 3. Now, censuses, numbering of the people has happened before. There's a whole book of the Bible called Numbers. Exodus 30 seems to set out a protocol for taking a military census to assess the strength, to find out how many people are available to fight. Remember that this would, in fact, be a numbering of all of the fit and able adult men in the kingdom, because there wouldn't have been a standing professional army. It would have just been anybody that could be called up to fight. Peter Lighthard again suggests that the problem then isn't so much that David chooses to do a census, but to follow the protocol, failure to follow the protocol. I would say it's a little bit more than that. It's actually that David, by doing this census, whatever the cause of it, is demonstrating a lack of trust in God. This is not something that God has told him to do. He acts from his own wisdom, his own desires, his own needs. And it seems to be in fear rather than trust and obedience. So David gets Joab and the commanders and says, go and count Israel from Beersheba to Dan and bring a report to me so I can know their number. And Joab replied, may the Lord multiply the number of his people 100 times over. My lord the king, aren't they all my lord's servants? Why does my lord want to do this? Why should he bring guilt on Israel? I want to push it a bit further there. There seems to be a sense in Joab's response that David is saying, go and find out who's really with me. Don't really know that. By the way, as well, just to track back a bit, even if the chronicler is talking about Satan, even Satan can still use another means to provoke this, that there could have been an attack. So there could be human involvement as well that provokes this. And it could even be that there is dissent within the kingdom, that David fears civil war. That would make sense of this this response that says, well, they're all the Lord's servants, David. My Lord the King, aren't they all for you to call upon? Why does my Lord want to do this? Why should he bring guilt on Israel? Holman's Christian Bible then says, yet the king's order prevailed over Joab. Literally, the king speaks strongly, persuasively, authoritatively to Joab. He overrules. 4-5, and so Joab comes back and he gives the number. There's 1,100,000 men that are able to fight and have weapons ready to do so. Incidentally, there's a little bit of a difference here. 2 Samuel 24, when you add the numbers up there, would suggest a total of about 1.3 million. Here, where 200,000 short, 1.1 million, you'll notice that Joab doesn't include Levi, Benjamin in the number. So it's possible that 2 Samuel has given the full total. That would suggest that Joab doesn't so much fail to count them as fail to include them in the final strength, that he's withheld them from his assessment of the overall army, that he is considering them not to be available for regular military duty. It's possible. Again, my type picks up on this. I think a couple of the commentators do. That's possibly because not really available. So actually, when I say it's Selman, sorry, wrong commentator there. The notes and says the the Levites would normally not be included in the fighting forces because of their priestly duties. Benjamin would not be included under that theory because the tabernacle, the covenant, are now within Benjamin's territory, making Benjamin carry priestly responsibilities. So that's one possibility why they are excluded and why Joab says, I'm not including them in. By the way, another possibility is that Benjamin is the source of discontent, and Joab knows that they are not really for David yet, that they are dissenting back, remembering that Benjamin had been Saul's tribe. Joab numbers, and he says, these are the people that are fit, ready, and available to you, David. What I want us to notice now is what happens, the consequences. There's revulsion, verse 6 to 8. So, three expressions of revulsion at what has just happened. First of all, there's Joab. Joab, who sees what David is doing as grievous, is not happy, not comfortable with this, and so he doesn't fully include everybody in his count. Because the king's command was detestable to him. Then there is God himself, and this is crucial. Verse 7, this command was also evil in God's sight, so he afflicted Israel, so a punishment comes. It's David, and timings here are interesting, but at some point down the line, as the punishment begins, David says to God, verse 8, I have sinned greatly because I have done this thing. Now please take away your servant's guilt, for I've been very foolish. David recognizes his folly. It says, I have sinned. He confesses his sin, and he asks for atonement. He asks for forgiveness, for his guilt to be removed and covered up. But before that happens, there is judgment. Look at verse 9 to 12. David is a prophet is sent to David, and they're given three options to take to him. Which do you want? Do you want lengthy 3 years of famine, a lengthy judgment, or 3 months of devastation by your foes with the sword? So a lengthy judgment or a short judgment, and that short judgment can either be devastation by your foes with the sword, so to be overcome by enemy forces. 3 days of the sword of the Lord, in other words, a plague, pestilence on the land, a disease, a pandemic, and the angel of the Lord bringing that. David answered Gad, and obviously he goes for the short, sharp shock. And he says, I'm in anguish. Please let me fall into the Lord's hands, because his mercies are very great, but don't let me fall into human hands. David says it's better for me to come under the direct justice of God than for this to come from other human beings who may have their own agenda wrapped up in this. Because I know that God is the God of love, and when he brings judgment, even when he brings punishment, his compassion and mercy are present in that, and that is not there with the harshness of human judgment. David is right. There is mercy and compassion in God's actions. And so verse 15 to right through to verse 1 bring this particular bit of the story to a conclusion. There's mercy and there is sacrifice. The two come together, and we're getting a bit of vital biblical theology here, aren't we? Mercy, atonement about. Plague has come and it is sweeping through Israel, and it arrives at Jerusalem, and it arrives personified. The angel of the Lord is about to destroy Jerusalem, verse 15. But as that's about to happen, as the plague's about to ravage through the city, God tells his angel of judgment to stop. Now, verse 16, David and the people of Jerusalem see the angelic figure. They see a vision of what is behind the plague. Fascinating, awesome, frightening. Imagine that scene. Well, at a place, Aranoa's threshing floor, a place that this man called Aranoa owns, that he uses to prepare his grain after harvest. 17 to 18, this is where the plague is reached, personified by the angel of God appearing in this vision. He can see the angel. Shows up. God's instruction to have an altar built there, to offer sacrifices of repentance. And then we see a bit of negotiating up in verse 22 to 23. Aranoa, he cares about God's people. He's faithful to the king. And when he knows what the king intends, he says, you can have the land. I'll give it to you. I want to help have this altar built. It's offered for free, but David negotiates up. He says, no, I'm going to pay the full price of it. Because verse 24, he says, I will not take for the Lord what is yours. Sacrifice a burnt offering that costs me nothing. It's the two things there. This is yours. I'm not going to take your thing to give to God. It's for you to do. Don't manipulate, control other people and their possessions and the things that they value and care about in order to maintain my relationship with God. There's something to follow through practically there, isn't there? And perhaps you will want to in your discussions. And also, I am not going to be offering something that costs me. There is great cost here, and David takes the cost on himself. He's not looking for a freebie. He's not looking to get out of this on his without there being cost to himself. And so verse 26, the price is paid, and so the altar is built. And verse 27 to 28, the punishment ends. The angel from acting. There are still consequences. Sin brings its consequences. Look at verse 29 through to chapter 22, verse 1. So verse 29 to 30, we see that David's fear of the angel limits his ability to come into God's presence, that the temple is up at Gibeon. Verse 29, the tabernacle of the Lord, which Moses made in the wilderness, and the altar of burnt offering were at the high place in Gibeon. But David could not go there before it to inquire of God, because he was terrified of the sword of the Lord's angel. So something is still holding David back. What is that? Is there still remnants of the plague around? Is it just that David is so nervous now? He knows that he's been presumptuous before, that he is nervous about going now to the tabernacle in case God becomes angry with him again. David acted presumptuously before? Was this the cause of anger? That's Messiah will do when he tries to offer sacrifices and take the priest's role. Or is there something else at a kind of human level here? In chapter 22, verse 1, David then decides that the tabernacle should be moved to Jerusalem. The ark and the altar will be brought together into one place. There's another possibility. Perhaps the issue is that the ark and the tabernacle have been separated, that David has been treating these two things as separate things and treating the ark as his personal possession. Maybe that's the issue there, that God is not speaking through the ark to David because he's doing things wrong and judgment is coming. Not worshipping in the way that God intended. Or maybe at a very, very human practical level, this supports that theory that we are seeing tensions within the kingdom. That if David's fear was of enemies, of hostility within Benjamin, and sees the angel of the Lord behind such hostilities now, that might make him nervous about going up to Gibeon. And might explain why he decides to bring the tabernacle close. The problem is we're not told that, and those are speculations. And if you were preaching on the passage, I would stay away from those speculations. It's interesting for us to discuss them, and you might again want to talk about them in discussion groups. But when you're preaching this passage, you need to focus on the main point here, that there were consequences, that David's relationship had been disrupted. That doesn't seem to be permanent, doesn't seem to be final, doesn't seem to be complete. This is not about him losing his salvation. Let's be clear about that. But there is a fear of God that is different to a healthy respect that has crept in. And so there are practical lessons from David for us here. So, number one, we see trust and doubt and crossing boundaries. David echoes Adam in Eden. He is tempted by the adversary, by Satan, just as Adam and Eve were tempted. Is the boundary. He gives in, he falls into temptation, he gives in to sin. Sin catches him, overtakes him. And so there is a lesson for us not to follow his footsteps here. To see the cost that temptation brings. So, secondly, David provides an example. If he provides an echo, an antitype of Adam, the fulfillment of Adam, then David is also an example to us, because we see here that there is no place for cheap grace. David recognizes that what he has done has been costly. There's no place for cheap worship. That our worship for God should come at a cost. Be willing to give everything, to lay all at the altar. David acts as a type himself, as a foreshadowing of Jesus. Again, there's no place for cheap grace. David is the one who pays the price, this time because of his own sin, but sin on behalf of Israel. Just as Adam's sin is on behalf of all of us, so we all sin in Adam, so Israel sins in David. He's their representative. And so he pays the price like Jesus, he takes the cost of that sin on himself in paying all at that altar, bearing the punishment there. A sacrifice that turns back God's anger, God's wrath. That's what atonement is. It's propitiation. And that's what Jesus did at the cross, paid the price for our sin, stood in our place, and by his sacrifice, God's anger, God's wrath was averted, was turned back. Ultimately, I want to suggest that this was God's purpose in bringing these events to bear in 2 Samuel 24 and in 1 Chronicles 21. Not just to deal with David, but to a picture of how he deals with us and how he deals with our sin. That this was an example, a story, an event for us so that we would grasp the horror of sin, but also the greatness of God's grace. And that's really how we should approach these events as we study them and as we preach and teach them. Well, thanks for listening, and do enjoy discussing some of those things. I will include the discussion questions when I post the notes at the weekend.